Hello everyone, hurry up to join to the today last session. I hope you all will be doing well guys. Let's join for the today last session. Hurry up guys to join the stream, making the like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you so much for your joining guys. A lot of love and respect for your joining. I want to know from the every single person where you're from watching the screen guys to join to the today's stream and have to write your name in the chat guys. Thank you so much for your joining everybody. Thank you. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat. Hello there, how are you my friend? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, making a like, subscribing to the channel and write down your name in the chat. Yeah, let's start for the today name writing last session. I hope you're all will be doing well, having the good afternoon right now guys. Hurry up to join the stream. Every person be quick to join guys, be quick to join and write your name in the chat guys. Dabra, how are you dear Dabra? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Dabra. How are you dear Dabra? Thank you so much for you joining to stream. Julian, how are you dear Jolan? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Jolan. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Thank you so much, dear Jolan. Let me change the pen, guys. Let me change the pen. Just give me, yeah, Jolan. How are you, dear Jolan? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Jolan. 1 second, guys. Just give me a while. Thank you so much. Riley, how are you, dear Riley? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Riley. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Moke, how are you, Moke? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Sorbita, how are you, dear Sorbita? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Sorbita. How are you, Sorbita? Thank you so much for your joining, to making the like and subscribing to the channel. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Harry, how are you, dear Harry? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you. Thank you so much for your joining. Thank you so much for watching from India. Thank you. A lot of love and respect, my dear. Yeah, every person have to write your name in the chat. To write your name in the chat. Yeah, every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. I want to know where are you from watching, to write your name in, yeah guys, to write the name. And also every respected member, don't forget to subscribing to the channel. For the support, you should have to send the laughing disco super chat. And thank you, Rashid. How are you, dear Rashid? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Abdul how are you, dear Abdul Ahan? How are you, Ahan? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Yeah, I want a laughing disco, my dear. If someone, laughing disco is my dream gift. Yeah. Petra, how are you, dear Petra? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Petra. How are you, Petra? Dago, how are you, dear Dago? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Yeah, and $1 lakh dollar is enough for me for the whole life. Lowry, how are you there, Lowry? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Lowry, how are you, Lowry? Thank you so much for you joining. Thank you. Braden, how are you there, Braden? How are you, Braden? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Braden. How are you, Braden? Thank you so much for you joining, Braden. Thank you. Alvaro, how are you, dear Alvaro? Thank you so much for joining, dear Alvaro. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Turkan, how are you, Turkan? Thank you so much for joining, Turkan. Anybody send a laughing disco, guys? Yeah, anybody send a laughing disco? It's my dream gift. Thank you so much, Nicholas. How are you, Nicholas? A lot of love and respect for you joining. A lot of love and respect for you joining, Nicholas. Thank you so much for joining, dear Nicholas. I write your name there. Emma, how are you, pretty Emma? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Emma. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Asbala, how are you, dear Asbala? Thank you so much for your joining, Asbala. Our how are you, dear Our Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring Our A lot of love and respect for you joining. Ari, how are you, dear Ari? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Ari. A lot of love and respect for you joining. How are you, Ari? Thank you so much for joining to sit to ring, making the law and subscribing to the channel. Christine, how are you, Christine? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Christine. How are you, Christine? Thank you so much for joining, Christine. Molly, how are you, dear Molly? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Elodie, how are you, Elodie? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Elodie. To do the super chat, guys, for completing my to help me completing my goal. Miraj, how are you, Miraj? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Daisy, how are you, Daisy? Thank you so much for joining, Daisy. Ali, how are you, dear Ali? Thank you so much for joining, Ali. Thank you so much for subscribing. Thank you. Minju, how are you, dear Minju? Thank you so much for joining, dear Minju. A lot of love and respect for you joining, dear Minju. Thank you so much for you joining. Afrain, how are you, dear Afrain? Thank you so much for joining to Setchering. Please send the laughing disco, guys. Yeah, Enzo, how are you, dear Enzo? Thank you so much for joining, dear Enzo. A lot of love and respect. Amelia, how are you, dear Amelia? How are you, Amelia? Thank you so much for your joining, Amelia. How are you, Amelia? Anissa, how are you, dear Anissa? Thank you so much for your joining, Anissa. Zobia, how are you, dear Zobia? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Zobia. Please, guys, send the laughing disco, do the super chat, guys, and also and also have to do the super chat, guys, for completing my goal. Thank you so much for your joining. Molly, how are you, dear Molly? How are you, Molly? Thank you so much for joining. Olivia, how are you, dear Olivia? How are you, Olivia? Thank you so much for joining. Hussein, how are you, dear Hussein? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Hussein. Irene, how are you, dear Irene? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Irene. Alana, how are you, dear Alana? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Alana. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Alize, how are you, dear Alize? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Eileen, how are you, dear Eileen? Thank you so much for joining, dear Eileen. And thank you so much for your joining, Josh, how are you, dear Josh? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Josh. Angel, how are you, dear Angel? Thank you so much for joining, dear Angel. Dana, how are you, dear Dana? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Dana. Sani, how are you, dear Sani? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Lindy, how are you, dear Lindy? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Lindy. How are you, Lindy? A lot of love and respect for you joining. Zaris, I cannot read your language, my dear. You should have to write your name in English. Thank you so much for joining to City Room. A lot of love and respect for you, my dear. Thank you. Addison, hurry, Addison. Thank you so much for joining to City Room, dear Addison. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Vandana, how are you, dear Vandana? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Vandana. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Thank you so much for your joining. Julia, how are you, dear Julia? How are you, Julia? Thank you so much for your joining. Yunchi, how are you, dear Yunchi? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Yunchi. Thank you so much for your joining, guys. Adordo, how are you, Adordo? Thank you so much for joining, Adordo. Please, guys, to help me completing my goal. Camelia, how are you, dear Camelia? Thank you so much for your joining, Camelia. Aline, how are you, dear Aline? Thank you so much for your joining, Aline. Katerina, how are you, dear Katerina? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Katerina. A lot of love and respect for you joining, dear Katerina. Thank you so much for joining. Camelia, I write your name out your. Yeah, guys. Dagger, how are you, dear Dagger? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Amir, how are you, dear Amir? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Amir. Aliza, how are you, dear Aliza? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Alexi or Alize. Sorry, Maria, how are you, Maria? Thank you so much for joining, Maria. How are you, Maria? Clara, how are you, dear Clara? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Hi, Satu, how are you, Satu? Thank you so much for joining, Satu. How are you, Satu? Thank you so much for your joining, Maz, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Laura, how are you, Laura? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, dear Laura. Thank you for subscribing, my dear. Thank you so much for subscribing my channel. Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Hi, me, please. Mara, how are you, dear Mara? Thank you so much for joining, Mara. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Thank you. And yeah, guys, do the super chat, guys, for appreciating our for appreciating and seeing my City Room, for my supporting. Lara Raj, hi dear, hi Wani, how are you, Wani? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Wani. How are you, Wani? Thank you so much for joining. Grayson, how are you, dear Grayson? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Grayson. Asma, how are you, Asma? Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. A lot of love and respect for your joining. Tabby, how are you, dear Tabby? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, dear Tabby. Bob, how are you, Bob? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Arifa, how are you, dear Arifa? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. And Antonia, how are you, dear Antonia? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Antonia, how are you, Antonia? Thank you so much for joining. I'm fine, thank you. Do you remember me? Yeah, Asma. Yeah, why not, Asma? Hamza, sorry, Hazim, how are you, Hazim? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Hazim. How are you, Hazim? And John, how are you, John? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. And Theodora, thank you so much for joining to City Room, Theodora. And yeah, guys, Aslim, how are you, Aslim? Thank you so much for joining to City Room. Nalan, how are you, dear Nalan? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, Nalan. And yeah, guys, Aubrey, how are you, Aubrey? Thank you so much for joining to City Room, dear Aubrey. How are you, Aubrey? Maureen, how are you, Maureen? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Maureen. Lana, how are you, dear Lana? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Lana. Someone do the super chat, guys. Someone do the super chat, guys. And also to send the laughing disco, Amir, how are you, dear Amir? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Nari, how are you, Dari? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Nari. Masiha, how are you, Masiha? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Masiha. Stephanie, how are you, Stephanie? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Stephanie. Eleni, how are you, dear Eleni? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Eleni. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Kamalia, how are you, dear Kamalia? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Kamalia. Sorry, Kamala, thank you so much for joining. Sultan, how are you, Sultan? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Carlton, how are you, dear Carlton? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Rehan, how are you, Rehan? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Asbella, how are you, dear Asbella? Thank you so much for joining, Asbella. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Rajuna, how are you, dear Rajuna? Thank you so much for joining, dear Rajuna. Rehan, Rajuna, my dear Rehan. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Rehan. Hurry up, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Sarah, how are you, pretty Sarah? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Nada, how are you, dear Nada? A lot of love and respect for you joining. Lana, how are you, dear Lana? Thank you so much for joining to the stream. Raka, how are you, dear Raka? Thank you so much for joining to the stream, dear Raka. Hurry up, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Nada, I write your name, my dear. Gory, how are you, Gory? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Gory. Aroha, how are you, dear Aroha? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Aroha. Lewis, how are you, dear Lewis? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Lewis. Are you the best pro? Thank you, my dear. Where are you from watching? Harry, how are you, dear Harry? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Your name is Judge. How are you, Chad? Thank you so much for joining. Tago, how are you, dear Tago? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Tago. A lot of love and respect. Thank you so much for watching from India. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. I know where is it? Chassis, how are you, Chassis? I was drinking the water, guys. Sorry for the wait. Maria, how are you, Maria? Thank you so much for watching, dear Maria. Rita, how are you, pretty Rita? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Rita. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, making a like and subscribing to the channel. V1, how are you, dear V1? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear V1. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Ayman, how are you, dear Ayman? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Rimas, how are you, dear Rimas? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Rimas. Charlie, how are you, dear Charlie? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Charlie. Aradim, how are you, dear Aradim? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Aradim. Asan, how are you, dear Asan? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Asan. Adarina, how are you, Adarina? Thank you so much for joining, Adarina. How are you, Adarina? Thank you so much for joining, dear Adarina. Mimi, how are you, dear Mimi? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Mimi. Malik, how are you, dear Malik? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Malik. Lara, how are you, dear Lara? Thank you so much for you joining, dear Lara. Hissam, how are you, dear Hissam? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Hissam. Nayana, how are you, dear Nayana? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Nayana. Ryan, how are you, dear Ryan? Thank you so much for your joining, Ryan. Thank you so much for your joining. Are you Muslim? Yes, I am Muslim, my dear. Masore, how are you, Masore? How are you, Masore? Thank you so much for your joining, Masore. How are you, Masore? Raisal, how are you, dear Raisal? Thank you so much for joining to Dream, dear Raisal. To write your name in the chat, guys. Adeline, how are you, dear Adeline? Thank you so much. Adeline, how are you, Adeline? Thank you so much for you joining to Dream, dear Adeline. How are you, Adeline? Thank you so much for you joining to Dream. Hurry up, guys. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Making the like and subscribing to the channel. Zigor, how are you, dear Zigor? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Zigor. Jomok, how are you, dear Jomok? Thank you so much for joining, Jomok. Vani, how are you, dear Vani? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Michael, how are you, dear Michael? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Michael. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Thank you so much for you joining, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Legendary, how are you, dear Legendary? Thank you so much for joining to set to ring, dear Legendary. Navidia, how are you, dear Navidia? Cavallo, how are you, dear Cavallo? Thank you so much for joining to set to ring, Cavallo. How are you, Cavallo? Suman, how are you, dear Suman? Thank you so much for joining to the city room, Suman. David, how are you, David? Thank you so much for joining to city room, David. Wani, how are you, dear Wani? Thank you so much for joining to city room, Wani. How are you, Wani? Thank you so much for your joining, my dear. Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Aruha, how are you, dear Aruha? Thank you so much for joining to featuring Aruha. Alani, how are you, dear Alani? Thank you so much for joining to featuring, dear Alani. How are you, Alani? Thank you so much for your joining. Melissa, how are you, dear Melissa? Thank you so much for joining to featuring, dear Melissa. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat. Hane, how are you, Hane? Thank you so much for joining to City Rim, Hane. Adana, how are you, dear Adana? Thank you so much for your joining, Adana. A lot of love and respect for you joining us. And yeah, guys, to send the laughing disco for the appreciation, guys, and do the super chat for the supporting. Yeah, guys, if any person can wanna have to do the support, boss, sorry, dear boss. Thank you so much for joining to sit ring, boss. Yeah, guys, if any person can support to click on the money icon to do the super chat, guys. Stephanie, how are you, Stephanie? How are you, Stephanie? Dalala, how are you, Dalala? Thank you so much for joining, Dalala. Robisa, why not Robisa? Abdu, how are you, Abdu? Thank you so much for joining, Abdu. How are you, Abdu? Robisa, how are you, Robisa? Thank you so much for joining to sit rim, Robisa. Chole, how are you, Chole? Rabisa, how are you, Rabisa? Thank you so much for joining, Rabisa. Alex, how are you, dear Alex? Thank you so much for joining to sit ring, Alex. Oscar, how are you, Oscar? Thank you so much for joining, Oscar. Stephanie, I write your name and you look that, yeah. Alia, how are you, pretty Alia? Thank you so much for joining to sit rim, dear Alia. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Jai, how are you, dear Jai? Thank you so much for joining to sit rim, Jai. Hurry up guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Aisha, hurry dear Aisha. Thank you so much for joining to sit stream, dear Aisha. Hurry up guys, every respected member have to write your name in the chat guys. Romeo, hurry dear Romeo. Thank you, Romeo, hurry Romeo. Thank you so much for your joining. Karina, how are you dear Karina? Thank you so much for your joining, Karina. Jai, how are you dear Jai? Alia, how are you dear Alia? Thank you so much for joining to sit room, Alia. Nina, how are you dear Nina? Thank you so much for joining, Nina. Lana, how are you dear Lana? Thank you so much for joining to sit room, dear Lana. How are you, Lana? Zoe, how are you, pretty Zoe? Thank you so much for joining, dear Zoe. Oh, thank you so much for the star. Thank you so much. Thank you. God bless you, my dear. Thank you. Savina, thank you, Savina. Thank you, Savina. Thank you so much for the star. At least, Salsa, or Salsa. Please, somebody have to send a laughing disco, guys. So yeah, somebody have to send a laughing disco. Pepper, hurry, Pepper. Kagan, how are you, dear Kagan? Thank you so much for joining to sit room, dear Kagan. Mizan, how are you, Mizan? Thank you so much for joining to sit room, Mizan. Anissa, how are you, dear Anissa? How are you, Anissa? Thank you so much for joining to sit room, Anissa. And Lilza, how are you, dear Lilaz? Lilaz, how are you, Lilaz? Thank you so much for joining to sit room. Aku, how are you, dear Aku? Thank you, Aku. To write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Minsa, how are you, pretty Minsa? Thank you so much for joining, Minsa. Yusuf, how are you, Yusuf? Thank you so much for joining to set a ring, dear Yusuf. Hi Landon, how are you, Landon? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Landon. How are you, Landon? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Yusuf, are you blind? Are you blind? You have to tell me. Dilara, how are you, Dilara? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Dilara. A lot of love and respect for you joining. Married Date, how are you, Married Date? Thank you so much for joining, Married Date. Amanol, how are you, Amanol? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Amanol. Thank you so much for your joining, Amanol. Amzad, how are you, Amzad? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Asa, how are you, Asa? Tumalo, how are you, Tumalo? Thank you so much for joining, Tumalo. Danala, how are you, Danala? Thank you so much for joining to stream, Danala. Please someone send a laughing disco, guys. Do a super chat, guys. Gracie, how are you, Gracie? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Gracie. Alani, how are you, dear Alani? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Alani. Zara, how are you, pretty Zara? Thank you so much for joining, dear Zara. Mazura, how are you, Mazura? Thank you so much for joining, dear Mazura. Mary, how are you, Mary? Xe, how are you, Xe? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, Xe. Nivea, how are you, dear Nivea? Thank you so much for joining, dear Nivea. Mortis, how are you, Mortis? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Please someone send a laughing disco, guys, and do a super chat. Yeah, guys, do a super chat, send a laughing disco for the appreciation, guys. Nishanit, how are you, Nishanit? Thank you so much for joining, Nishanit. Sophia, how are you, Sophia? Yeah, guys. Junior, how are you, dear Junior? How are you, Junior? Eunice, how are you, Eunice? Thank you so much for joining to a stream, dear Eunice. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Netsuki, how are you, dear Netsuki? Holly, how are you, dear Holly? Maha, how are you, pretty Maha? Sarili, how are you, dear Sarili? How are you, Sarili? Lesila, how are you, Lesila? Please, guys, don't spam. You will be got time order from the screen if you're trying to spamming on the screen, guys. Yeah, if someone has to try to spamming on the screen, he will be got the time order. Yeah, Taylor, how are you, Taylor? Thank you, Taylor. Bell, how are you, dear Bell? Thank you so much for joining to stream. Every respected member, please, guys, send a laughing disco or flustered for the appreciation of the stream. Khushi, how are you, Khushi? Yeah, guys, don't spam on the screen, guys. Just have to write your name in the chat, guys. Bean, how are you, Bean? Thank you so much for joining to stream, dear Bean. How are you, Bean? Every respected member have to write your name in the chat, guys. Ruth, how are you, dear Ruth? Thank you so much for your joining, dear Ruth. Zoe, how are you, dear Zoe? Thank you so much for joining, Zoe. Hurry up, guys, to write your name in the chat, guys, making the like and subscribing to the channel. Hadley, hurry, dear Hadley. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, dear Hadley. Name, hurry, dear name. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Anybody have to send a laughing disco, guys? Send a laughing disco, please. SL Zoda, hurry, SL Zoda. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. SC, hurry, dear SC. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Hadi, hurry, Hadi. I write your name, my dear. Amelia, hurry, dear Amala. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Amalia. Please, guys, anybody can do a super chat by gold, guys. Tamur, hurry, Tamur. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Tamur. John, hurry, dear John. Anybody can do a super chat, guys. Thank you so much for your joining. Tago, hurry, dear Tago. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Tago. Dana, hurry, dear Dana. Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Aline, how are you, Aline? Please, someone do a super chat, guys, please. Dago, how are you, Dago? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream, Dago. Alice, how are you, Alice? Thank you so much for joining, Alice. Anybody can do a super chat, guys. CB, how are you, CB? Levy, how are you, dear Levy? Laura, how are you, Laura? Please, guys, someone do a super chat, guys. Emrali, how are you, Emrali? Thank you so much for joining Twisted Dream. Yonvi, how are you, dear Yonvi? Thank you so much for joining, Yonvi. Dalina, how are you, Dalina? Anybody can send a super sticker. Dinara, how are you, Dinara? Anybody is going to sending the laughing disco right now, guys? Anybody is going to sending the laughing disco right now?